Hello everyone and welcome to Tariq and welcome to the special segment called Tariq Schools, especially for the class 12th history. And आज का जो chapter that we're going to discuss is Kings, Farmers and Towns, Early States and Economies from circa 6th century BCE to circa 6th century CE. So after the Harappan civilization, as we know, कि Harappan civilization was it kind of just went to the sand and it was not there after 1900 BCE, and then you have a time frame of almost 1500 years जिस वक्त ऋग्वेदा लिखी गई थी, one of our important texts of ancient period. And then you also find that we have towns coming up, new states coming up, early states. Then you have your kingdoms coming up, especially in northern India. Then you have Karnataka, the Plateau region, and South India as well. And also new way of disposing the dead people by burying them, and also the megalithic structures on those buried where the bodies were buried. Then you also see kingdoms emerging, right? Towns emerging, and obviously because towns and kingdoms are there, that means polity is there. Then you have the society that is coming up. Society is there, that means agriculture is also flourishing in that particular region. Then you had pastoralists also. And to study all this, historians have used various means, various sources, especially inscriptions have been used to study, this part of the history. And this is what this chapter is all about. So not only inscriptions were used by the historians, but coins were also used, various other scriptures that were used. So in चीज़ों से, in sources से, historians try to understand the past, the polity, the society, the economy of the past, and the relations between the politics, the society, and economy.
1830s की बात है जब इंडियन एपिग्राफी सीन में देयर वाज अ मेजर चेंज. एपिग्राफी का मतलब इंस्क्रिप्शंस की स्टडीज, और 1830s में जेम्स प्रिंसेप नाम के एक आदमी जो इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के मिंट में काम करते थे, ही वाज सक्सेसफुल इन डिसाइफरिंग टू स्क्रिप्ट्स, द ब्राह्मी स्क्रिप्ट एंड द खरोष्टी स्क्रिप्ट, which changed the scene of Indian history completely. This he did by comparing the script with Greek, where it occurred in some cases, and इनमें इनको एक इंसान के बारे में पता चला जिनको प्रियादसी या फिर पियादसी के नाम से बुलाया जाता था. And in other instances, in the same context, the same person was referred to as the King Ashok. And we only knew about this emperor from Buddhist texts. And the thing about religious texts is you will not consider them as a historical text because they're mostly of a philosophical nature. So this opened the horizon for history and the understanding of history and how we can gather information from languages that may be extinct or may not be used in the current pretext at all. What this also did was open up the perception of history in relations to the political powers that were prevalent at that time. How whatever person was, whatever group or whatever was happening in the political scene, how did that affect the economy, the society, the regular people. And ज़्यादातर लिंक्स होते थे, लोगों को मिले भी, लेकिन वो इतने भी स्ट्रांग नहीं थे कि आप बोलो कि अच्छा इस रीजन में ऐसा हुआ था because of this or things like this. So research is still carrying on for that.
Because this chapter is covering a time frame from 6th century BCE to 6th century CE when it comes to politics, farmers and economy. So when we look at the 6th century BCE, it's actually the turning point in history because you see early states coming up, cities flourishing, coinage developing, also the use of iron. Then we see two major philosophies coming on the forefront, that is Buddhism and Jainism. And also you have important Mahajanapad, 16 Mahajanapad, but we'll be telling you the most important ones, and they were Magad, Avanti, Kushal, Vajji, Kuru, Panchal, Gandhar, and they were the most important Mahajanapad. So when we look at these early states, so we get to know that some were monarchy, where this particular region was ruled by a king, and some were sanghs or gans, जैसे oligarchy system होता है where men collectively rule a particular place. Like Vajji was such an example. Lord Buddha and Lord Mahavir, who you know that they are Buddha belongs to Buddhism, and he is the, you can't say the founder, but he was the thought, the process जो एक religion में बना है, it's because of him. And then you have the 14th Tirthankar, which is the last Tirthankar, who is Mahavir of Jainism, and they both belong to the oligarchy sects. Janpad also means where Jan means people, and Janpad means people where they set their foot. And this term has been used extensively in Sanskrit and Prakrit. Though history in जगहों की it's very difficult to, because sources की कमी थी, but some of these Mahajanpad, they almost were there for 1,000 years. Then all these Mahajanpad had a capital city, and these capital cities were fortified. We had the army which was there taking care of these capital cities, and for maintaining the army you needed the resources. 6th century BC onwards you also find the Brahmins writing a text called Dharma Sutras. So that meant that guidelines were written down for the Kshatriyas, how to conduct themselves, what a Kshatriya or the Raja or the king is supposed to do. He's supposed to collect taxes and tributes from the farmers, artisans, and was supposed to protect the people that he was governing. The Kshatriya were supposed to raid the neighboring states to procure tributes. That was a legitimized way of procuring tribute from the neighboring states. And also standing army, some maintained standing army, some maintained bureaucracies. Also militia sort of thing was also maintained, where the peasantries, where the peasant, they were recruited for a particular period of time whenever there was war or they were supposed to raid the neighboring states. So these were the guidelines written down by the Brahmins for the Kshatriyas. So this was the basis of the Mahajanpads of the 6th century BCE.
So between the 6th and the 4th centuries BCE, Magadh, जो current Bihar में located है, it gained prominence and became almost the most important cities of the 16 Mahajanapadas. And this, the historians have debated over the reasons as to why Magadh became so prominent, how it became so powerful, and there are a variety of reasons. Firstly, it's the location. The land is very productive for agriculture. Iron mines, which are in present-day Jharkhand, they were also readily available for tools and implements and all that. आपको forests में जो मगध के forests थे उसमें आपको readily elephants भी मिल जाते थे. And it was located at a place where Ganga and its tributaries formed an excellent communication system. So all these factors together made Magadh a very powerful Mahajanapad. Buddhist and Jain scriptures also attribute the success of Magadh to ruthlessly ambitious and powerful kings. Of these we know of Bimbisar, we know of Ajatashatru, we also know of Mahapadmananda. They implemented their policies very, in a very powerful manner, and that is also what drove Magadh to its glory. तो जैसे हर महाजनपद का एक capital होता था, मगध का भी capital होता था. Rajgah, which is a Prakrit name for Rajgir, which is located in present-day Bihar, used to be the capital of Magadh, and Rajgah literally means the house of the king, and it was a fortified settlement in the mountains. Later, the capital was shifted to Patliputra in the 4th century BCE, where it had a command over the riverine routes of the Ganga. So it controlled like the trade network through river and also the communication channels.
So was Patliputra is like present day Patna?
Exactly. So Patliputra is present day Patna in Bihar.
The growth of Magadh culminated in the establishment of the Mauryan Empire, and Chandragupta Maurya, which was around circa 321 BCE, was the founder, and he was the most important ruler. He was the founder of the Mauryan Empire, and his empires from Magadh, it went as far as Balochistan, Afghanistan, and then his grandson Ashok, and Ashok ko kaun nahi janta, but his grandson Ashok also conquered Kaling, which is in the present day Odisha. Various sources have been used by historians to study this empire. So you have archaeological sources like the sculptures, then you have literary sources. So there was an ambassador, a Greek ambassador called Megasthenes, who came during the time of Chandragupta Maurya, and he wrote Indica about his empire. Then we also have Arthashastra, which was written by Kautilya or Chanakya, who was there during Chandragupta Maurya's time. He was his minister. And you also have Ashokan inscriptions, pillar inscriptions, rock edicts, which is one of the most important finds, and through that you get to know about the Mauryan Empire. You also find Buddhist texts, Jain texts, Puranic literature, Sanskrit literature mentioning about the Mauryan Empire and its rulers. But the most important are the pillar inscriptions, pillar rock edicts inscriptions. So Ashoka was the first ruler to write his thoughts on these on the pillars or the rock edicts, and which actually means which came to be known as his Dhamma. What he thinks of Dhamma also, I think it means dharma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the Prakrit word.
Prakrit one, yeah. And in that he would always write respect to elders, respect the Brahmins and the ones who've left the materialistic world. Be kind to your slaves, be kind to your servants, and also respect people of other religion and tradition. Just don't respect people of your own kind, but also the others, because from this we get to know that at that point of time also this empire was pretty cosmopolitan. People from other walks of life, people from other religion, they came and settled down. That is why he's mentioning on his pillar edicts, pillar inscription and rock edicts, that you are supposed to respect the others. Though the mode, like the language that was used was Prakrit, written in the Brahmi script, but in the northwest frontier, you will find Aramaic language, you will find the Greek language, inscriptions written in Kharosthi, so that his message is spread across his, I think, the borders or something like that, so that people who are traveling, they would come, they would read and kind of spread about him to the other places.
Now, as far as the administration of the empire was concerned, there were 5 major political centers. The first was, of course, the capital, which was Patliputra, but there was also Taxila, there was Ujjaini, there was Tosali, and there was Swarnagiri. Now, all these are also mentioned in the inscriptions, and the message that were mentioned in the pillar and the rock edicts, pillar inscriptions and the rock edicts, were generally uniform in all these areas. So the question that arises is, could the administration have been uniform throughout the empire? Historians have debated this, and it is unlikely that the administration was uniform throughout, because Afghanistan or Orissa mein kafi antar hai just in the terrain itself. So it's likely that the regions close to the center were where the governance was at its maximum, and towards the periphery or towards the further west of the empire is where you have maybe the local governments or the local ways functioning better. ये जो provincial centers हैं, they were also chosen with a lot of care, because when you see Taxila and when you see Ujjaini, they were located on major trading routes, and Swarnagiri, as the name itself gives away, it means a mountain of gold, and it was located near the gold mines of Karnataka. Now, for such a vast empire to function, communication was also key, both over land and riverine routes. And empire इतना broad है, communication के लिए आपको provisions की तो ज़रूरत पड़ेगी ही, but you would also have to cater for the protection of whoever is traveling, whether it be soldiers or your political heads, or even merchants and regular people. And for this, Megasthenes also mentions that there was a committee that was organized with 6 subcommittees that were part of the militia. And one subcommittee looked after the navy. There was one that was responsible for foot soldiers, one that was responsible for horses, elephants, chariots, and even the provisions that were necessary to cater to such a big just establishment. And of this, the subcommittee that looked after provisions was the one that had a lot of work to do, because they had to arrange for food, they had to arrange for transport and all of that. But this was not all, Ashoka also tried to, strengthen his empire by propagating his philosophy, or what we today known as Dhamma. So he had special Dhamma Mahatmayas, or the officials that he appointed to spread his message of Dhamma and to make sure that his message is being transferred to people, and the layman also understands what he means. And Dhamma in itself had a very egalitarianistic outlook. It was very basic. It was not religious as such, but it was based on Buddhist principles.
Yeah, the basic sort of thought process and the basics of life that a
Yeah.
person needs to understand.
Just be kind to one another, that kind of things. Now, from whatever is left of the account of Megasthenes of India, he also mentions a variety of officers that look after the rivers, or they look after the land, or they measure the land the way that they did in Egypt, and they also take care that the sluices of dams, they are functioning properly, so that the water from the canals are let out at an even pace, so that everybody has access to water. And the same people also manage the huntsmen, and they either reward them or punish them depending on their actions. And they also collect taxes, and they just look after people who have occupations regarding the land, so miners, woodcutters. Now, as vast as the empire was, there are also debates on how important the Mauryan Empire was in totality. Of course, when it was discovered, it was a huge thing to have an empire of such grand proportions to come out of the subcontinent, because at that time when it was discovered, India was still a colony under the British Empire. So we also gained a nationalist fervor with it. You had art that came out of the Mauryan Empire, which was just, to this day you quote examples of how majestic and polished the art that came out of the Mauryan Empire is. And also the messages of Ashoka himself, where he's trying to establish a conversation with a layman. It was a very humble act of his. So even him taking up the title of Piyadasi, which is just like beloved, so it's like a very humble term. It's not like the grand this thing, although that also happens, but this is also like a very important aspect of the Mauryan Empire and Ashoka per se. But even so, the empire did not encompass the whole of the subcontinent. It could not reach down south, and although it did reach up till Afghanistan, it was very likely that the local governments were the ones that held sway, and Ashoka, or the Mauryan Empire in itself, did not have that much control over the far-flung regions of his empire. And even when you have to consider the time frame of the empire, the Mauryan Empire only stretched up till 150 years, which, when you consider the history of the subcontinent, is not that long a time. And even by the 2nd century BCE, you see that a number of chiefdoms have already started emerging.
The Shastra also gives us a glimpse of how the military organization, the minute detail of military organization, especially when it comes to capturing elephants. So when they had to capture the elephants, they would have the elephant guards, guards who were guarding the forests, people living in the forest, the one who nurtures the elephants, they along with 5 to 6 female elephants capturing the wild ones, and then also people who would enchain the elephants. They would also accompany them when they had to get kind of tame the elephants for the army, for the military purpose. Greek accounts, they also tell us that the Mauryan Empire, the Mauryan king, emperor, they did not mention the exact king, but he had around 6 lakh foot soldiers, 30,000 cavalry, 9,000 elephants, and according to some historians, these are pretty exaggerated details and accounts. Now when we shift to the southern part of our subcontinent, we come to the chiefs of Chera, chiefs belonging to the Cheras, Cholas and Pandyas. So these were the southern states, and they came under Tamalikam. That is the Tamil country at that point of time, which covered the area of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala and some parts of Karnataka. And these chiefs are different. Of the Tamilkam chiefs were different from the kings, so they were not hereditary. They were given gifts by the people, and they would collect those gifts, and then they would distribute it amongst their subordinates. So he will not keep the king's share, like how the king would extract revenues, but they would get that in the form of gifts, or they would get tributes from people, and they were very different from the kings. He was supposed to indulge himself in warfare. He did not have a standing army per se, but only during the wars they must be recruiting people to fight for him. Also arbitrating any disputes. There is an excerpt from Sila Padikaram. It's a text. It was written for a Pandya chief called Sengutavan. In that, when he visits a forest, so people come running to him, singing songs and dancing. It's how the defeated people, they come and meet the new master, giving him gifts in the form of honey, sandalwood, or fans made out of fur, baby tigers, flowers, food, and various vegetables. So these are the various texts that from these texts we get to know about the people of Tamilkam, the chiefs of Tamilkam, and also we get to know about them from literature called Sangam literature. So there are poems in that literature that praises the chiefs of the Cholas and Chera Pandya, the people who were there, the chiefs who were there in that point of time. So when we come to the 2nd century BCE, we come towards Satvana. Satvana was also they were apparently after the Maurya Empire kind of died down. So we get to know about the Satvana kingdom. So they ruled in the western part of the subcontinent and also the central part of the subcontinent. We also get to know about the Shakas. They were people of Central Asia and who ruled this part of Central Asia till the northwest frontier of India. And the origin of these people, it's not very certain, but once they claimed their power, they would also kind of claim their social status. It was like once you become the king, now you will try to legitimize your rule, to kind of link your ancestry to a particular divine force or something like that, right? So now we'll get to know how they did that. When we come to claiming high status, we get the best example from the Kushans. Kushans were rulers who ruled parts of Central Asia, northwest frontier, and they ruled from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. So the Kushan rulers के बारे में we get to know through inscriptions, through coinage, and also literary sources are there, and from that we get to know that they started to link themselves to a divine being, right? So you will find colossal statues, especially near a mutt in Mathura. We also find these statues in shrines of Afghanistan. And the Kushan rulers adopted titles like Devputra, like the son of God, similar to how the Chinese ruler would do it, son of heaven, right? Then we come to the Gupta Empire, which was 4th century CE, and usme you get to know that in the Gupta Empire, these kings, they depended on Samantas. So these Samantas were the people who maintained themselves through local resources and they controlled over land. They paid homage to the Gupta rulers and also provided with military assistance when the time needed. And at times, these Samantas could be so powerful that they became the king, and the weaker ruler would become a subordinate. We get to hear of lot of poems written for the Gupta rulers in their praise. With flowery language is used, and you cannot use them as a source.
It's not an accurate description.
Yeah, and these were known as prashastis, So you can, and you also find coinage and you also find inscriptions, and these prashastis were there written in, you would make basically in praise of the Gupta rulers. And one of the most important of these is the Prayag Prashasti in Allahabad. In the Prayag Prashasti, you see Harishena, who was a poet, who wrote a poem in praise of Samudragupta, who was the most powerful Gupta ruler. But we cannot use them as sources because the exaggeration that has been used in praising the emperor, until unless you will find proper literary sources.
Yeah,
Or
because these poems were also
Yeah.
made for the
Made
king.
for the-
So you
they
were
were-
like,
yeah.
you are so great, you have done
Yeah.
such great things. So it
Yeah.
was meant to please the king instead
the
of
king.
like holding a mirror to
Yeah.
whatever was
Yeah.
happening. Now, unfortunately, history largely remains one sided, where you often and more popularly hear the version of either the king or the people with the means of recording history. And lay people or regular people in the Indian subcontinent did not really record their own lives and their own histories. And therefore, what we have is a one sided look at history from the point of view of the king or the ruling party. Now, historians have tried to counter this by looking at tales from the Panchatantra or the Jataka, because these more often were oral tales which were committed to writing fairly later, like the Jataks specifically were committed, are texts in Pali, and they were committed to writing in the middle of the first millennium CE. Now, one such tale from the Jataka is the Gandatindu Jatak, in which the tale is about a very wicked king whose subjects are just not happy, and these subjects are regular people, old women, traders, even animals are really unhappy by his reign. And so one day he disguises himself and he goes among the population just to get an idea of what his people think about him, and all of them are literally cursing and abusing him and saying that, you know, it's so bad living under this guy that we are just leaving our village and we are going into the forest. So this tale actually gives a very it gives a different opinion on how kingship happened in those in that time, and also it provides like an alternate history to where you have something from the people coming up and saying, you know, we were not happy with the way that we are being ruled and it is so bad, we are considering going to the forest and leaving our jobs and leaving our homes. And it's very likely that the relationship between the ruling class and the people from the rural areas was not on the best of terms, and it's very unlikely that you will have a very good relationship, because even in a democracy in present day and, you know, in previous years, we there will be a section of the population which is not happy even in a democracy of the ruling power, and this is the government that you elect yourself. So at a time when it was hereditary and it was a monarchy, it is less likely that people would be just completely happy with however they were being governed. And oftentimes, in that time, the taxation rights were also exceptionally high. And so the regime was just very oppressive to a layman who was maybe a farmer or a cultivator or, you know, something like that. And he would just find it so oppressive to work under such a ruling class that he would consider leaving and going into the forest. And another way of tackling this is if the ruling class could, you know, gauge the emotion of the people that they were governing, they would then try to bring in reforms, whether it be in the fields of irrigation or agriculture, just to make the lives better. Now, one such strategy was to shift to plough agriculture, which largely happened in the fertile alluvial river valleys of the Ganga and also the Kaveri from the 6th century BCE onwards. The iron-tipped ploughshare was used to turn the soil in areas with specifically high rainfall, and also in parts of the Ganga river basin. Transplantation was adopted as far as paddy was cultivated, which of course led to an increase in production, but this also meant that whoever was doing that, it included back-breaking labor for that, for the producer. Now, although the iron ploughshare led to an increase in productivity, its use was limited to certain areas. For example, in the semi-arid regions of Punjab and Rajasthan, this was not adopted till the 20th century. So the use of the iron-tipped ploughshare was pretty limited to one area. And even when agriculture happened in the hilly tracts, hoe agriculture was more easy, or it was more beneficial than an iron plowshare. Another way of increasing production was by the use of irrigation, which happened either via canals or artificial tanks that were built by communities or by either by the local political head or by the king or the state. One such example is that of the Sudarshan Lake, which is, I think, the most famous example of it all. Initially, it is an artificial tank in Gujarat, and initially it was built by the local governor under a Mauryan king. The inscription dated to about the 2nd century CE mentions that Rudradaman carried out repairs on this tank because there was a storm, and that led to a few cracks in the reservoir, and he took out the repairs of the tank without taxing the population. And in the same inscription, we find that there is an input which dates to about the 5th century CE, where a Gupta king again carried out repairs of this tank.
When we look at the rural society, you will find differences in the class structure. Buddhist tradition, they always refer to landless laborers, then you have small peasants, and then you have large landholders. Gahapati is the term used to denote the small peasant or the larger landholders. These larger landholders, or the village headmen, they controlled a good amount of control over their cultivators at that point of time. And Gahapati is not only the term is used for the large landholders or the village headmen, but also for a person who's living in a house and he owns his wife, his children, his servants, his slaves, his animals, like that. And also sometimes it is used for the wealthy merchants. Sangam literature also tells the class structure which was there, like the landowners were known as Viralar, and then you have the plowmen known as Udavar, and then you had the slaves who were known as Adimai. From the early centuries to the Common Era, we also find land grants being made to a group of people, especially to the Brahmins or the religious institutions, and they were recorded. So these grants were recorded, especially on sometimes on the stone plates or copper plates were there on which these transactions were recorded. So then they were given to the donis also. It was like जैसे आप कोई दुकान में जाते हैं and you buy something and you give a bill. It was something similar to that. Then we come to know of an incident, especially I think in the 4th century during the Gupta period. Prabhavati Gupta was the daughter of the very strong Gupta ruler Chandragupta II. So she was married into the Vakatakas. She had access to land grant and she had made donations also, but because at that point of time women did not have access to land, but because she was because she was a queen, she was not a commoner that she would not have the access. She did make land grants. These inscriptions also give us the they tell us about the Brahmins, the other people, the peasants. They tell us about the how they were supposed to give their produce to the king, how they were supposed to serve their new lords in the village, and how they were supposed to serve the kings. The inscriptions that was these land grants were inscribed on the copper plates or on the stone inscription. They were basically in Sanskrit or at times in the regional languages. So if it's in the Deccan area, you will find them in Telugu or in Tamil, if you are the language that was commonly used and not in Sanskrit. We also find that some of these land grants were smaller plots or could be vast uncultivated land given to the Doni. The reason why they were given, there are two, three reasons to it. According to some historians, because they wanted to bring a lot of other areas under cultivation, under agriculture, the king donated land. Or at times, because the king was weaker and he was not able to look after his land, he gave land grants. And also when the Samanta was getting very strong, so they gave land grants, they donated lands. So these were the reasons why land grants were given at that point of time. These land grants not only tell you about the people, the Brahmins, but also the relationship of the state right, with its people, with the cultivators. But there were a lot of other factions like the hunting gathering society, or the hunting gatherers, hunter and gatherers, or the fish folks, or people who did not depend on the sedentary lifestyle. They were exempted from these land grants, and and also because in these grants you will still see mention of the peasantry, the cultivators, and the other menfolk, but these people are exempted from the mentioning of these people from the grants. So we don't know about them. Were they part of it or not, or what was the relationship of the state with these people.
Coming back to the urban centers and of the Mahajanapadas, we have seen that most of these urban centers were oftentimes the capitals of the Mahajanapadas, and they were located at very prime locations. For example, Patliputra was located close to a circuit of riverine routes. There was Ujjain, which was the hub of land routes. There was Puhar, which was located near a coast from where a lot of sea routes began. And other cities like Mathura were a hub of commercial and political activity. Now, unlike Harappa, where you had vast stretches of land that was not inhabited, we can't really excavate the locations connected to the Mahajanapadas because they are heavily populated to this date. So we have an idea that the ruling class lived in fortified cities, but we haven't been able to do much material research on the people of this time. A few materials have come out and that are available for research, and they include a wide range of objects, most specifically pottery that is called the Nadan black polished ware. Now the Nadan black polished ware has a glossy surface, and it is speculated that it was an item of luxury and it was only possessed by the rich. Now there are other objects that have also been found, including ornaments, tools, weapons, even figurines, and they're made out of a vast variety of materials like ivory, silver, gold, copper, iron, terracotta. And this is something that is available to gain an idea about the kind of people that were there during this time. Now, by the 2nd century BCE, we have votive inscriptions that are commonly used, and they give an idea about the kind of people that are making donation. Now, a votive inscription is something that is inscribed on anything that is donated to a religious organization, and oftentimes the name and the occupation of the person is mentioned. And through this you see a variety of people that are being mentioned, from potters and weavers and teachers, religious teachers, kings, carpenters, goldsmiths and blacksmiths, and just like a variety of people making donations to religious organizations. Sometimes the name of guilds or shrenis are also mentioned, and it's very likely that this guild procured the raw materials, they made a product, and then they finished and were selling the final finished product to be made to donated at a religious institution. And it's very likely that craftspersons used iron tools to meet the need of the growing urban elite.
From the 6th century BCE, the subcontinent was crisscrossed with land routes and with land trade routes, and also sea routes and riverine routes. So we have mentions where they tell us that this was the time when the trade was flourishing, especially even the trade through the sea routes, especially from Bay of Bengal it went to China. From the Arabian Sea, the trade route took place beyond the Arabian Sea and reached to West Asia. It reached Africa. At times, the rulers also tried to control it by providing protection in lieu of a price, obviously some tax, some sort of tax. Those who traversed these routes were peddlers who walked on foot, and then you had the merchants who used caravans, and they also had packed animals, bullocks. They used bullocks. Then you also have seafarers who traveled through sea, and they traded with other seafarers, and this was pretty risky but also beneficial. Then you also find mention of really rich traders. They were pretty rich. They were known as Seths in North India. Then you have Satvahas, and you had Masatuvan in the Tamil inscription. You get the mention of those people, and they indulged in these trade. Commodities that were traded, basically, they were cotton was traded. Then you had pepper. You had metal ores, you had medicinal plants. In Rome, medicinal plant and pepper was in high demand, so it went from here. Then you had grains, you had cloth. So these were the commodities that were, traded to and developed. They were exported to different places. अब ये ट्रेडिंग एक्टिविटी तो होती है, पर हमको ये समझना ज़रूरी है कि somewhere the coin or the bullion must be used for these transactions. So we get to know from the 6th century BC onwards the use of punched mark coins.
Yeah.
Right? Especially in copper, in gold. Then, especially during the modern period, you will find the use of coin. And the king was the one who issued it. But at times, the merchant, bankers, or townspeople also issued these coins. Numismatists have to reconstruct the past, they have studied these coins. We get to know that the first time when we see symbols on the coins or some sort of, names written on coins, we find it through the Indo-Greeks, at the time of Indo-Greeks who ruled the subcontinent. The first coins to bear the names of the rulers or to have the figures of the rulers were the Indo-Greeks who ruled us from the 2nd century BCE. The first time when we see gold coins being used is the time of the Kushans, right? And also they are very similar in weight and style as when we compare it to the Roman coins and also the Parthian coins of Iran. And these coins have been found in northern India, parts of northern India and central Asia. The wide usage of these gold coins indicate the enormous value attached to these transactions that were taking place. We also find the tribal kings called Yodhyas of Punjab and Haryana issuing copper coins. That means they were really interested in such economic transactions. We also find hordes of Roman gold coins in southern India. So that means that's what it states, that these coins or these transactions were not only limited to the borders, they were everywhere. So that shows the economic transactions that were taking place, the trading networks that was establishing worldwide, especially with the subcontinent. Some of the spectacular gold coins that we find belongs to the Gupta period, especially when it comes to the quality, the purity of gold coin that has been used in that period. But the problem arises is in the 6th century CE, we see the usage of gold coin tapering off. So but what is the reason? So historians, they tell us that there could be because the Roman Empire had collapsed. So the people that were benefiting from that empire also somewhere they were affected. Trade routes got affected, trading parties got affected. Or there was a circulation of coins that was taking place. Hoarding was lesser, but the coins were getting circulated. Because we do, though the usage of gold coin is less, but we do find the mentions of usage of gold coins in the inscription. That means it's in circulation. Yeah, that could have been a possibility.
Now coming back to how deciphering the inscriptions became something that was plausible, and now we are able to use the inscriptions to decipher history. How did we come about deciphering these scripts which are not really common Indian languages anymore? So when you consider Brahmi is the parent script for most modern Indian scripts that we use today. And it took European scholars and Indian pandits a long time to come to an understanding of how the Brahmi script is, and they oftentimes would get Bengali and Devanagari, the Bengali script and the Devanagari script, and they would try to work their way backwards into understanding how the alphabet evolved over time. And after a lot of work and a lot of years worth of work is when James Prinsep was able to decipher the Brahmi script in 1838. Here we'll take a little break to mention that the script and the language are two separate things. So while Brahmi is the script, the language that is used is oftentimes Prakrit or Sanskrit, depending on the location. It was for a very long time believed that the inscriptions were made in Sanskrit, whereas the earliest inscriptions that we find, and a vast majority of them, are in Prakrit and not Sanskrit. Now, Kharoshthi is a script that was used in the northwestern region of the subcontinent, and how that was deciphered is a different tale altogether. Now, in that area, there were a lot of Indo-Greek kings that were settled, and they also made inscriptions, and oftentimes they were made in Greek as well as Kharoshthi. And European scholars who could read Greek were able to compare the two scripts and just
make a
correlation and figure out what this might be. And once it was understood that in many of these inscriptions, Prakrit was the language that was used in the Kharoshthi script as well. So they were able to notice that okay, the A in the Greek and the A in this Kharoshthi inscription is similar for a name such as Apollodotus, as is mentioned in the book. And that is how they were able to gain a correlation and decipher the script. Now the epigraphists have managed to decipher the scripts, and there is a whole host of inscriptions that is available. But now how do you use that to gain a historical accurate understanding? Now when you consider the inscriptions and the edicts that were left by Ashoka, in many of the inscriptions he is not mentioned.
Yeah.
So it's you find the inscriptions made by Piyadasi or Devnampiya. Devnampiya means beloved of the gods, and Piyadasi means pleasant to behold. So the inscriptions are made out in these names, and in one or two instances his name is also mentioned. Now once the translations from the inscriptions and the edicts are collected, and you see that they're largely belonging to the similar writing styles and the content is somewhat similar, so you're able to gauge that okay, it is from the same person. And then in one odd inscription maybe Ashoka is mentioned as Piyadasi or Ashoka is mentioned as Devnampiya, which gives you more confidence to state that okay, all these inscriptions were issued by Ashoka. Now we have all these inscriptions, and they give us a very clear understanding of the workings of Ashoka, of his thought, because he is establishing a contact with the people. But there is also a question that arises, which is how much of it is true and how much of it is exaggerated. Now as a political head, even as a religious head, or when you have power, there is a tendency you give way to exaggeration. So in one of the inscriptions there is mention of before me nobody had ever made provisions for finding out what was happening, or that nobody ever got reports from the people, and I am the one who has now done this, and I've made this possible. And it is glorifying, it is like a self-glorifying inscription. But again, when you notice the Mahajanapadas that existed before that, maybe they were not as great in scale as the Mauryan Empire. But is it possible that the king or the head did not get reports from the people at all?
No.
So that is also up for speculation, how much of it is true to the word and how much of it is just like a manner of glorifying.
Yeah.
Another assessment that we as historians have to make is that, okay, you find these inscriptions, but how much of it was available to the public? Where was it located? Were they located in places which were traveled frequently? What were the materials that were used? Could a layman be able to read the inscription? Was the layman educated enough to read it? So all these questions are also there, and it's very difficult to get a proper answer to these questions. And then another question that arises is, okay, the king has passed an order, but were those orders followed?
No.
Or is it that he passed an order because the opposite of that was happening, and it was just like a means of saying, okay, everything is okay, please don't do this? So like, was it, instead of saying that, okay, it was such a great time that, these were the thoughts of the ruler, but was it because the opposite was happening and he was just trying to cover it up, or trying to say, okay, don't do this, but were they even being followed?
Yeah.
One such example is given also in source 11, where the inscription of just the emperor's anguish at war is being conveyed to the people, and this happened after the war at Kalinga, and he was very remorseful of that. But these inscriptions are not found anywhere close to Kalinga, so as far as the people of Kalinga are concerned, Ashoka is not remorseful at all, but for the rest of the population, he has a lot of anguish and he's very regretful, and war is bad and he should not be, warfare should not happen at all. But for the affected people, none of those messages were being conveyed.
Inscriptions के ना काफ़ी limitations भी होती हैं, because at times a letter is missing from the inscription, or sometimes the letter that has been engraved वो मिटना शुरू हो जाता है. मतलब sometimes the meaning of a particular word at one point means something else, and at the other point it will mean something else. There are a lot of limitations. Major limitations are such that lots and lots of inscription may have been lost because not survive the ravages of time, right? Not everything that happened could have been engraved on the inscription, whether political, economic, like everyday life, sorrows, happiness, and everyday agriculture practices could not have been inscribed on the inscriptions. Contents of inscriptions, they tell you the perspective of the one who is inscribing them, and they need to be juxtaposed with others' perspective to come to a conclusion. Many a times these inscriptions are in thousands of numbers and at times you cannot decipher them. Right? You are not able to decipher them. They're just lying there. Right? So these were the limitations. At times, historians of the 19th and 20th century, their their interpretation also varied. Right? Many historians in the 19th century were more, more bothered, or they were more interested when it comes to only the kings. In the later period, things started to change. People wanted to know more about other people. So these are the limitations that we find when it comes to the deciphering of inscriptions. That's all for today, and do not miss to read the boxes, the sources that you have in your chapters, because that they are very important from the board point of view.
And we also suggest that you read the book as well, because you get a better understanding when you read, and of course an audio or a video supplement to it always helps, but nothing will beat reading the actual source of the knowledge.
By chance we've missed a point.
Exactly.
I hope you've liked today's episode. Please like, share and subscribe, and keep watching Tariq.